Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in the beautiful state of Trumpistan.
The beautiful state of Trumpistan.
Led by the Texas Taliban.
See, exactly. Who's sad to see that Ken Paxton didn't become the latest Attorney General nominee, but
I lost a nickel on that one. I thought he was chalk. Yeah.
Well, it is Donald Trump, so it's not over till it's over. I guess you could say that.
You might get a call. You never know.
Exactly. We've been doing this series on the 25th anniversary of the battle in Seattle, the World Trade Organization protests. And we have a couple more episodes that we're going to do before we wrap on the series. But so far, what we've talked about is folks who are on the ground in Seattle, people who organize it, people who took action, all of that sort of stuff. But another important piece of this is how it actually sparked a movement and influenced organizers all over the country and all over the world. And the sort of origin story of the Green and Red podcast is that Bob and I actually met right around the time of the World Trade Organization protests in 1999. Bob and I actually did meet in 1999, but didn't really get to know each other until about a year later. But what evolved out of that was that we actually ended up doing a lot of anti-corporate globalization organizing in Houston. And so what we wanted to do with this episode today is actually talk about the influence of that movement and how it influenced us in the organizing work that we did in Houston for probably 5-6 years after the battle in Seattle.
Yeah, I think it's a good kind of case study. Houston, in many ways, you wouldn't think it because it's Texas, right? But it's actually a pretty good city to organize this kind of stuff in. Because in so many ways, it was the headquarters of kind of the global economy, right? Oil. And then in that particular era, it was really important because Dick Cheney had come from Halliburton. And so we have Halliburton, came out of KBR, which are all Houston based. George Bush was president. He was from Texas. And it's a big city. So that actually, I think, gave us some positive steps that we could take. But it's also Texas. I think it's a good case study in how to organize. And yeah, the key to this is what had happened in Seattle, which just changed our worlds in so many ways. Just a tiny bit of background. Because before that, I got to Texas in 95, and I immediately started doing stuff in the community. I started doing radio interviews, a lot of stuff like that. And then I started going out. And I got involved with the local AFL-CIO, which at the time was working on issues like NAFTA, which it had opposed, and the WTO. And so I started working with that because as a professor, I knew a little bit about it. I went to their meetings and I did some talks, and then all of a sudden word got out. Starting in 97, 98, I began to go to churches and community groups, even bars, to talk about this stuff. And when in early 1999, I was actually teaching about it, talking about it quite a bit. And that's when, as we mentioned in our interview recently, I met Kevin Donner. He came to campus to talk about Seattle, like this protest they were planning for Seattle. And I was vaguely aware of Seattle, but didn't know a whole lot. He promised they were going to shut it down and everything. And as I pointed out, and told him, that guy's like, yeah, they did. And that really sparked, I think, a lot of people all over the country. We started to see stuff emerge all over. And that's when you and I got going in Houston with, I think both of us had read about organizing. We'd been involved in things, but neither of us had ever been actually doing the organizing ourselves. So we hit the ground. And as I recall, it starts, I think, with two different communities, the University of Houston for the most part, but we also had students from Rice and elsewhere. So students, and then artists. I think the art community was really involved. And remember, from the start, Jim Harris always very generously let us use the station or the Art Car Museum for events. So we were lucky in that regard. We were in a town where these issues were already at the fore, and we had a community there we could immediately go to and start working on these issues.
Yeah, and I'll say that Houston's the fourth largest city in the country, and especially if you go to Houston today, Harris County, Houston is considered a blue county. right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of more open-minded people, Democratic voting people, liberal people, which also creates space for more radical activism, in my opinion. And Houston had been like that for a long time because it was such a large city. It's also affluent, and there's a number of like larger universities, like Bob talked about, where people are getting like new ideas and things. There was also a couple what I would call like radical institutions, pains, which had existed in Houston for quite some time, which actually fed into some of the organizing that we did. The two that I really want to name is there was Houston Food Not Bombs. Food Not Bombs is a movement that had been around since the early 80s. It was a very anarchist, direct action minded group where they share food with whoever, but it's mostly feeding the homeless. We'll probably do, at some point, I hope to do a show in the future on Houston Food Not Bombs Today, which has actually gotten a lot of attention and has been under a lot of scrutiny from the city of Houston. There was this sort of anarchist mindset with a lot of people that we organized with, anti-authoritarian, doing things a little bit more. And so that was a big element in some of the organizing with some of the people who were in this group that Bob and I co-founded with others. And the important piece, I think, which was like really relevant to the downtown Houston area, was there was actually a pretty big anti-gentrification campaign, which also had existed in Houston for a long time. And they had wanted we actually recently talked with Roy Vu about the Vietnamese community in Houston. And one of the things that we talked about in that was some of the gentrification that happened to public housing and older neighborhoods in Houston. And so that was also a big element of what was going on there. And so the organizing that we did was anti-authoritarian, but also anti-corporate. It was very critical of developers. It was very critical of the oil industry, which also was rooted in Houston, which we'll also talk about through the course of this talk today. But I just want to point out that those two institutions and those sort of two issues were like pretty important and vital to some of the work we did.
In addition to that, a lot of the people who ended up working with us, we met through the campaign for Pacifica. We talked about that with Dennis Bernstein, something about a month ago, right?
Yeah, Free Pacifica campaign.
The Free Pacifica campaign. So many of us met under those circumstances, and that was a grinding campaign. We weren't out trying to impress the world. We were just trying to get rid of a certain group of people in Houston. And so we cut our teeth on that. We did neighborhood protests, and we just raised all kinds of hell and went to meetings. And
the Free Pacifica campaign was important because that's where a lot of us met and got to know each other as we did that work too, which is really important to building a community.
Yeah. Our executive producer, Habingham, and Sheila and Shannon, and Moody, our musical director, and so many other people. But yeah, there were people doing things, and we gave them kind of a space and a larger community. And we were pretty open. We had people who identified as anarchists, people who identified as socialists, people who didn't really have any identification. We had people who were just there because they were attracted to more cultural issues like vegetarianism or veganism. And we always tried to make a point of how these things fit into this larger issue of globalization. And at the time, a bit about it, I became, I think, pretty well versed in it because I was going out and really doing a lot of media, doing a lot of talking. Even up in Austin at University of North Texas invited me. I started going all over and doing that. I felt like an evangelist. And it was really cool to be able to go into Houston now and start to use this. And at one point, remember, we were starting groups on campus. I think this may have even been before HGAC, or I don't know. But remember, there was a certain amount of money available for each political group on campus, for each student group on campus. We got people we knew, and we formed like how many? We had 10 different, sources where we could ask for money, and we used that as well. So we were able to take advantage of that too. No, that's what it's there for.
Yeah, exactly.
I was faculty advisor to 6 group one time or something like that. We just signing my name off with. But that was cool. So we had structure in place that we could go to because I think we were familiar with the 60s historically. I think we probably read Saul Alinsky by then, but a lot of this was just, and the Pacifica campaign, I think, helped too, because there were some older people there who'd been involved, senior people who were, really good at this and they had a background. So I think we learned from them as well. So grinding the Pacifica campaign out was, I think, very important because then, we formed HGAC, probably it was 2000, right? Right after
the summer of 2001.
Was it one? Oh, so it was much later. So we had these campus groups going already there. Okay. Yeah. Because I remember doing stuff we had started making. Oh yeah, because we'd started making plans for the big meeting in DC and all that.
Yeah. The biggest protest that never was.
Yeah. But I don't know, I guess it wasn't HGAC, but we started bringing people in too to speak about things. We also worked with community groups like the Rothko people and everything else, but we started bringing people in ourselves too.
Yeah, and I think that was like an important piece of what we did was we formed a group. We figured out ways to get funding, and then we embarked on this process, which is a little bit of what we do with the podcast, is to do political education, to raise consciousness. And so we brought in, it was starting, I think we mostly started in the summer of 2001. We basically began to bring speakers in. And our goal at the time, which was only for about 2 or 3 months, was to go to these IMF World Bank protests that were going to happen in September of 2001. And so we were raising money for travel. We were building consciousness in Houston. We actually maybe built up a crew of 30 or 40 people that we were going to take with us. And because the revolution was happening in DC, is the way we all felt about it. And I think it was like pretty important.
I mean, if you're of a certain age at the time, it was pretty cool because I hadn't seen anything like that for a while. You know, in the 80s, you had the anti-nuclear movement and the Central American movement, but those had political support too. So it wasn't like a grinding thing in the streets. This was really the stuff in Seattle. I just remember we were talking about it. We were looking at it on video. It was just amazing, right? It said, okay, we got to do something here. And I think the first part, like you said, is but we were bringing people in even before we thought, let's start a group of our own. We were having speakers come in to talk about these. Kevin Donaher and Global Exchange people came in a lot, pretty frequently, actually. We had,
and they had programming around that, where that was their thing.
Yeah, exactly. This is when we met our mutual friend, Provok Chatterjee, who was working on kind of Halliburton and all of these war profiteering issues. And so we started to bring that issue in. So it was pretty cool. We had access. That was the cool thing. Like, we're these, people in Houston, Texas. We got to know people all over the country, and we were able to make calls to people and get fairly well-known folks to come in. But yeah, that first task we had was just letting people know that this was a problem. And one of the cool things about globalization, and of course, who took advantage of it? Donald Trump, right? But we understood this is an issue you can use to talk to a lot of different kind of people. That's hard for a lot of the stuff we did. There are certain people who probably are not really approachable in a lot of the stuff we do. But this was one issue, I think, where we could go to various groups and talk to them. We talked to the FL-CIO, mainstream labor, who they don't want to be seen with a bunch of scruffy radicals. And I talked to church groups, talked about democracy. And so we were able to use that. And eventually, when they started doing protests downtown and stuff, we reached like a whole different group of people. But I think to some degree, the issue lends itself to that. It's an issue which I consider a left issue, but it's also an issue you can use it to address these issues of class and wealth and privilege and things like that. I think that helped us too. We could reach people by talking about this.
Yeah. I also felt like because of the momentum of what we'd seen in Seattle, and then like protests, actions after that, like A16 around the IMF World Bank in 2000 in Quebec, where they had the free trade area, the Americas meeting, is that people who were in any way politically minded gravitated towards us.
Yeah.
And we had a pretty solid community group. And through this Pacifica work, a lot of the older people in the community supported us, at least financially, if not in other ways.
Yeah, we did. And that was, really important. We had, really established a fairly significant presence and fairly quickly, right, in town. And we just did a lot of events. Remember, on campus, and this is before HCAP was formed, 2 or 3 times, very graciously, our economics professor, Tom DeGregory, agreed to have debates, which on campus, you don't see all this BS about what a great environment it is for academic discourse. Not really. And Tom, who actually is pretty good politics, he's not. But on this particular issue, he's really a big supporter of development and modernization and things like that. And we had a lot of debates, and I was really appreciated him for that and respected him. But we had great turnouts for those things too. Every time we had one of those, we had a lot of people show up. And so we were a presence on campus, in the community at large, and starting to get in the media as well. And I think what we did, in retrospect, we didn't really sit down and plan it out all that much. We just did it. But I think it worked well, because immediately we get caught up in this kind of national group of people who are doing this. And we're not from New York, we're not from the Bay Area, but at the time, being from Houston, I think gave us a little credibility because it's a big city. We started talking to people, doing more stuff.
Yeah, exactly. What derailed us in a way, but also allowed us to sort of regroup and refocus, is this huge event which happens on September 11th, which is where the planes crashed into the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon. And we at first didn't know what to do as many people in the world didn't know what to do. And then the Bush administration starts a war in Afghanistan. So where we'd been doing this political education around corporate globalization, we had been organizing protests and things like that around some of the corporate players in Houston. We refocused for a while in a bigger coalition, which didn't really work out because it's really hard to organize with the Revolutionary Communist Party. But we were able to refocus, and many of our political education events, for example, became events around the history of U.S. empire, for example. And so that also became very important too. Oh, we were basically like challenged and by what I would call now provocateurs or disruptors. One was the Revolutionary Communist Party. The other were the followers of Lyndon LaRouche. They would constantly come and try and disrupt our events as well. They never came to the protests. They were always afraid to come meet us in the streets, but they always did come to our teach-ins.
There were certain people who were pro-Zionist members of the local Democratic Party involved in KPFT politics who made our lives very difficult too.
Yeah, so, yeah, that was the third party.
Yeah, we can't really forget about that. But no, and the thing was, after 9/11, we were able, we could sit back because that's an issue in left activism in American history. In the 60s, you have these movements for civil rights or women's rights or whatever, and then Vietnam comes in. And these other things take a secondary role when everybody focuses on Vietnam. So, well, we did that too. To some regard, but we were able also to do it under the banner, and by that time of the Houston Global Awareness Collective. That within days after that, we had stuff on campus. We had 2 or 3 teach-ins within the first 10 days after 9/11. Huge turnouts. I mean, literally standing room only. We had local media there, and we had brought in like professors from Rice to talk about Middle Eastern history. I talked about the U.S. and it was just like stuff like that doesn't really happen, and that was a big deal. I'll never forget that night. The local TV cameras, standing room only, overflow crowd, people freaking out. And it was really a decent community service to try to calm people down and let them know there's stuff we could do.
Yeah.
And then wasn't that initial meeting, that was going to be held like in September of 2001, right? We were going to DC. Wasn't it really coming up very quickly, within a month or so?
It was like supposed to be like September 27th, 2001 or something like that.
Yeah. So
we were weeks away. We had our ticket, I think.
Yeah, we raised a lot of money. We had enough to cover, I don't know, 12, 15 people. Just like, we did a hell of a job raising money.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's an important thing to note is, and that was happening all over the country. Yeah, really all over the world. It was this moment where these movements were actually getting global attention. Our institutional power holders were really worried. When we talked with Danaher recently, he talked about how they had a press conference. It was pre 9/11 that included labor and faith leaders in one part of the sort of left spectrum, and the other was like black bloc anarchists. And so it was like this sort of coming together movement. People were going there from all they were expecting 100,000 people to go march and take action. And I think the power holders were very scared. I don't want to feed conspiracies. I don't really actually believe in those conspiracies, but it was a terrible thing that got derailed, I will say, by 9/11.
Yeah.
To be derailed by 9/11.
Yeah, it was. But even then, we were able to organize. There was an event scheduled then for April of 2002, a big anti-war march. And I remember going there. And a lot of people there, another group actually in Houston, who I have to give a shout out to, would be like the Pax Prisky, Dorothy Day types. Ken Crowley and Dave Atwood and so many others, Lee Lowe, Marty Lowe. And these are older folks, but they really embraced us. They could have just said, oh, we don't want to be around those kids, but they were really cool about that. And I think that helped us a lot too. First of all, they helped raise money. But it was also cool just to have this kind of community. Like I said, it was a topic where we could reach out. I don't think I've ever been involved with anything where you could reach out to so many disparate groups, and have a chance of talking to it. Because usually we're dealing with kind of a certain number of people. Although, as we pointed out many times, the left does a bad job of reaching out to people. There's common ground. It's hard to meet people where they're at when the Proud Boys or whatever, but there's still areas where we can meet people. And now one really demonstrated that. But the stuff we did back then, we reached out and talked to people, faith groups, Latin groups, remember the immigrant groups when we were doing the CAFTA thing? Yeah. What was her name? A woman very active in the migrant community groups. Maria something. I can't remember her name. Yeah, she's great. Jerry Kelly, Father Jerry Kelly. was always supportive of us.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note, even though 9/11 happens and the sort of Seattle movement gets derailed, is that there was still a lot going on. And some of it was anti-war stuff and some of it was still anti-globalization stuff. And those were two areas where we really sort of did a lot. I can't believe I still survived. I survived that with all the lack of sleep and all the stress and everything. But those were two big sort of paths that we took. And sort of Central American Free Trade Agreement protests, which actually the meetings
were in Houston. Yeah.
Gina Vargas, who was Bush's CAFTA rep, and then also the anti-war piece, which we actually, I feel like we're very strategic for converting that into an anti-corporate campaign, which was like really smart. And
yeah, we really were able to pivot that and connect that, and it really, and to being in Houston, that really, I think the crowning achievement was everybody knew what we had Chomsky out here, remember, in October of 2002.
Yeah.
Talk about what everybody knew was an imminent war, huge event, overflow crowd at UH. I mean, like people showing up, it would fit in. It was a really big deal. And luckily we got a little time. Some people in the community were trying to steal them away from us. Luckily we did get at least an hour where we could sit around and the students could talk in after you guys had worked so hard and raised all that money to bring in here and everything like that. And then, so that was an amazing event. And then it was very clear that Bush was going to invade. We just weren't sure exactly when, but we had a pretty good idea. Beginning in early 2003, we said, okay, let's like raise the heat. So we began, I guess at the time there was a deadline, right? Did Bush give them like I forget what it was, get rid of Saddam.
It was March 2003.
It was like to get rid of Saddam, right? I think they wanted his head on a plate or something like that. So I think about 6 weeks before that, we said, let's do things. So we started to go to Halliburton. Was it Halliburton or
KBR?
It was KBR still at the time. And we started doing,
Halliburton owned KBR,
but it was still, the building itself was still said KBR on the front, right?
Yeah.
The KBR logo, yeah. So we started going downtown. I think it was on Wednesdays.
Yeah.
And we did it like, I think at 6, because people be getting off work like 5:30 or 6. And we were good at propaganda, and through the kind contributions of certain unnamed people who let us use their Xerox machines and we didn't have to pay for it. We always had the kind of propaganda. We'd have hundreds of sheets and we would try to make up little kind of quickie fact sheets and things like that. So we were prepared and we got to these things. And I think it exceeded anything we could have imagined.
Yeah. And it really sparked something in Houston, I think, is that we did just these sort of weekly noise protests at KBR, and we passed out a lot of information as people were leaving all their downtown corporate offices. And it was amazing the amount of support that we got. But the thing about it is that the KBR Halliburton work really morphed into a bigger campaign where we were really 1 year, 2 years later, we really actually got the attention of lots of people from outside of Houston. We got a lot of global media, all of that sort of thing, and launched this anti-corporate campaign against Halliburton. And just the background is that Dick Cheney had been the CEO of Halliburton, and then Halliburton had also gotten these like what they called cost plus contracts to basically go and do logistics in Iraq after the U.S. invaded and occupied, and KBR was a subsidiary which actually did it. And so it's,
and they got the contracts before the war even began.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We went to people, and that was the part I think that was great. We could talk to them and say, hey, do you think this is fair? These guys, they're getting these contracts even before the war began. They're going to get rich. You're not getting anything out of this. And they were pissed off. See, unlike Democrats, we're allowed to be anti-elitist. But I think that really, because that was the whole pitch, is like, these people are like screwing you over too. And yeah, it was really incredibly satisfying to see how many of these kind of Gorber types coming out of these offices, usually they flip you off, and sometimes they're condescending, but I'm pretty sure this was legit. They really were like pissed off. Plus, the oil company itself, despite the kind of left blood for oil, the oil company itself wasn't all that geeked up about going to war either. And the oil industry itself wasn't really that geeked up in early 2003.
No, but these corporate war profiteer campaigns actually were what would really kind of hit, like land.
This was Bush and Cheney's war, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I'll say that we had a really clear demand, which was like, stop the cost plus contracts. Yeah. No contracts to these war profiteers. And not that Bush and Cheney was ever going to end the contracting. And then we were also fortunate, one, the war was happening. And then two, we did this into the 2004 election. And we were able to really elevate Cheney, connect Cheney to this. And so we went in May 2004, we actually did a huge direct action demo at the Halliburton shareholders meeting, and turned out like 500 to 1,000 people, which is actually saying something for Houston on a weekday morning to like protest and just cause a lot of trouble for Halliburton. They were completely thrown by it. The Houston police was also very thrown by it.
We also did stuff regarding the Enron meltdown, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
We went to the country club and saw George Bush.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because we were also doing this anti-corporate globalization organizing when Enron had its meltdown, which I think was in like early 2002, which was like,
I believe so. Yeah.
It was before the invasion, and it was a couple of years before we really got into the Halliburton stuff. But it's true, we went and protested. River Oaks is basically the Beverly Hills of Houston. And so we went and protested at the River Oaks Country Club. And who happened to be driving in that day? George H.W. Bush.
Who I think gave thumbs up to somebody. It was basically about Kenway and Skilling. Yeah. And it was funny because even at the country club, a lot of them were like, yeah, let those fuckers ride. A lot of their class collaborators at this point, like, screw.
We also went to Skilling's house that morning too, after we left the country club, and Skilling actually came out and talked to people.
I left before that. I wish I'd been there. That sounds pretty exciting. The one thing I do remember, which is great for my ego, I got a call. The Financial Times was doing an article about Texans opposed to Bush and Cheney. And just a bit earlier, a country group called the Dixie Chicks, right? And Natalie Maines had come out and said, I'm ashamed to be from Texas. So they called me up. And it was cool because this story in the Financial Times was about Texans who opposed George Bush, and it was about Natalie Maines and Professor Robert Bazanko. So that was great. I'm 1 degree removed from the Dixie Chicks, or 2 degrees removed. But no, it was really fantastic. I think explaining the way this worked was really exciting, getting through to people. Essentially, this was insider trading, right? Cheney was using his connections, and they were like, a lot of these people were upset about it. I'm curious today because that's the vibe that Trump, wittingly or not, understood in 2016, and that he played on. These people are screwing you over. He talked about forever wars. He talked about profiteering. And he's not serious about all this. He's getting ready to hand Miriam Adelson the entire West Bank. God knows what he's going to do elsewhere. Probably going to definitely try to strangle to death Cuba and what else. But at least rhetorically, he understood that these issues were important to Americans. But we were talking about that over a decade before that.
Even 2 decades before, a decade and a half before.
It was like the untold story, the globalization.
Yeah. I think, and I'll also say that there were, a theme from these sort of 25 years after the Battle of Seattle has been this sort of how American politics has been derailed by free trade and NAFTA and all of that sort of stuff. And as someone who considers, I was an organizer through that, I was a partisan, for lack of a better word, through all of that. And I think the less the left was engaged in the politics around corporate globalization and corporate power and all of that sort of stuff. Like, they talk about capitalism, but they also talk just a lot about like identity stuff. And not that identity stuff isn't important in some regard, but I think the less we talk about those sort of corporate power abuses and things like that, and then we're inherently separating ourselves from the right. And then someone like a huckster like Trump is able to come in and take advantage of that. And all of these like working people of all colors basically began to like take more interest in things that he has to say, because it's the same message. It's anti-elite. It's anti some of these companies, and people are like really resonate with that. Trump's also a huckster and a liar, so you shouldn't really believe anything he says. But they really caught on something there that we knew 15 years before Trump and Bannon did. I think it's an important thing to ponder.
And I think people have to understand, after the WTO, globalization, those are liberal democratic issues,
right?
As much as anybody's, I would argue, more, right?
And neoliberalism comes out of the Clinton years, right?
Only before that, Jimmy Carter, but definitely Clinton, right? And NAFTA, as we know now, NAFTA was utterly destructive to American politics. Before Trump, Ohio was a blue state. whether that means anything or not. But they actually had some decent people there who were, and as pro-labor as you're going to get, like Sherrod Brown was actually a pretty decent senator, right? And NAFTA just upended that. In Ohio was, like I say, it's like Texas North. And recently, the Democrats just saw a bloodbath. They lost Michigan and they lost Pennsylvania, and that's Wisconsin. And there's no reckoning. They're still unwilling. They're basically still saying, we went too far to the left, right? And NAFTA and the WTO and all of these transnational agreements. And why do you think people don't know what tariffs are? But like half of America, and at least support them, right? Because you're doing something against another country that's exploiting me. It's globalization, right?
Yeah.
It's a bad idea. And I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, people would talk about tariffs back then. Because the whole point of these institutions was to avoid that kind of thing, to create these free trade regimes. And so now we're back where we started. And, it is unfortunate that during the campaign, I didn't follow it that closely, but based on what I saw, J.D. Vance made more statements that were critical of corporate elite and actually supportive of Lena Khan than Harris or the Democrats did. Now, like I said, I didn't follow that closely, but it seemed like they were willing to engage this issue way more than the Democratic Party was.
Yeah, exactly. Matt Gaetz also is another supporter of Lena Khan. The point of this, and I'll let you the last word, but for me, I think it was just like historical events can inspire you, right? And I think November 30th, 1999 really did that. It was just, we were already talking about this, but it really became like the world had opened up and it was like, there's a possibility here. There's something possible here. And I have to say for that year and a half, before 9/11 was probably the most kind of hopeful I felt in my political life. I've been around a while now and was really encouraging. And then obviously 9/11 kind of threw everything off the tracks. But again, I think in early 2003, we did some great work there as well. But this is the history and the legacy of the left in the United States. We're small, we're splintered, and we don't have big institutional support. Within that context, I think we did some good stuff. And it's important, I think, to understand now, all these years later, because it's pretty depressing right now. Yeah. The last word I'll say on this is the sort of build up to us starting the Houston Global Awareness Collective is that a bunch of us sat around someone's house and watched This Is What Democracy Looks Like, which was like a documentary, which actually you can see on YouTube, which is a documentary about the battle in Seattle, the protests in Seattle done by Rick Raleigh and Big Noise Films. And I want to say that when I watched that movie for the first time, which I've watched easily dozens of times since then, I used to show it to my class when I taught community college.
Well, we used to have community events where we showed it.
Yeah, exactly.
A recruiting thing, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I was like, I want to go there. Why was I not there? And it was a very inspirational thing. And to watch what was happening in the streets of Seattle, I think was very important, which is part of what turned me into an organizer. I'm friends with many of the people who actually organized the shutdown in Seattle. And it was just a important moment. And I agree with Bob. It was between November 30th, 1999 and September 11th, 2001. It was this moment where you actually had hope that there was some level of change that was going to come. And it's hard to have that now. I'm still not giving up on that, but it's a hard thing to phantom, particularly these days. And so I'm just going to throw that. I guess that's my last bit. And one other thing I'll say is I actually feel like the political education that we did was actually really important. It was very important for me to develop as an activist and a radical and an anarchist or what have you. And so that was also like really important. We definitely need to see more social media, not social media. Need to see more political education that's not on social media. So I just want to put that out there too.
And my last thought is 25 years later, and we're talking about it. And that's pretty cool. Again, it has some real meaning. We talk, about to other people and what it meant to us. So hopefully 25 years from now, I'll be long gone, but other people will be recounting tales from 2024 or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Folks, I'm going to wrap it on that. You've been listening to Green and Red Podcast talking about the influence that the battle in Seattle had on the formation of the Houston Global Awareness Collective. If you'd like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on one of the many audio platforms we're on, give us a rate and review. And then if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and become a supporter by hitting that support button, or go to patreon.com/greenredpodcast and become a patron at Green Red Podcast. And until then, organize, make trouble, misbehave, and we'll talk to you all again real soon.